Right, this lecture is on the Jerry Fodor reading. It's a response to the sort of reductionist program um, of Nagel, right? Now, Nagel just, to be fair, only describes what reduction is, right, or what he thinks it should be, um, which is sort of an independent question of whether it can actually be carried out, right? Um, Fodor is going to argue that that sort of reduction very likely can't be carried out in what he calls the special sciences, what Nagel calls secondary sciences, right? The things like economics, psychology, um, that are for the reductivists supposed to be um, ultimately describable or explainable, right? Reducible to fundamental sciences like physics. Okay, so Fodor wants to see whether, right, given a sort of Nagel style account of reduction, um, whether it is the case that all the special sciences uh, could eventually reduce to the primary science of physics. And he wants to be careful to distinguish that sort of claim about reductionism from physicalism. So you can be a physicalist and say, yeah, all there is are physical things, right? Um, Agree with the physicist that, yeah, my body and all my mental states and even economic behavior, that is ultimately all just particles moving around, right? That can still be true, but you can deny that the sciences that describe those more complicated things like economics and psychology, that those can be reduced to the laws of physics. So two separate things. And he points out, just in the general sort of intellectual culture, that reducibility to physics is taken to be a constraint on the acceptability of theories in the special sciences. So if I come up with a theory in psychology, but it doesn't say anything about brain states, and it's not like clear how it could even sort of reduce to brain states, then people are going to tend to suspect that theory as probably not very good, right? It's taken to be like a background assumption that a good theory will be reducible to physics ultimately. And Fodor doesn't agree with this general intellectual climate, and he says that, and it kind of has, among other things, a curious consequence that the more the special sciences succeed, the more they ought to disappear, right? So, if you're a reductionist and you think a really good theory in psychology should ultimately reduce to biology, chemistry, physics, then what you're saying is a really good theory in psychology should become useless. Really, all we need is the fundamental. Okay, so let's a little bit gets a little bit formal here, but I hopefully at this point you should be comfortable with these arrows and these predicates and the X's and stuff, right? So um, here is what Fodor says is basically a Hegelian account of reduction. So let law one here be, or number one here be a law of the special science S, right? So maybe psychology or something. So we have if S1X, then S2X. Basically what that means is uh, all situations of one type bring about situations of another. So maybe it's psychology, right? And it says um, at all and for everything, right? For any person, say, if they desire water and believe that there's a glass of water in front of them that is, not poisoned or whatever, normal water, then it'll bring about an S2 situation where the person drinks the water. It'll bring out a behavior. So this is a common sort of explanation in psychology, at least people talk about. You have a belief and you have a desire, that's the S1 situation, and that's going to result, all things being equal, in a behavior, the S2 situation. So if I want to reduce this law in the special sciences uh, to a law in physics, I need three more things, right? I need number three here, which is a law in physics, right? Which is supposed to be um, according to Nagel, this will be a law that, along with some bridge laws, I can deduce my law in the special sciences from. And then I also need the bridge laws, and that's 2A and 2B. So 2A says S1 situations are identical to, this is right, you have a biconditional here. We'll explain what that means. It's not really clear what it means. Fodor has some questions about what it is. But and anyways, in logical language, this would say I have a S1 situation if and only if I have a P1 situation, right? The P1 situation being some state of affairs in physics. So like, maybe something like I have a belief that there is water in front of me and a desire to drink water if and only if I have a certain, right, neural state in my brain, say. And then uh, 2B is the S2, right? So in my example, it's the drinking of the water. And this would say I have water drinking behavior if and only if there's some, um, right, physical state of either the neurons in my brain and my muscles, or if you want to go further into physics, some arrangement of subatomic particles. Right? But so it's just an identity between whatever the special science is and the state of the physics, right, that is supposed to underlie um, the more complex description of that same state of affairs in the special science. Okay, so this is supposed to be, this again, this is just the Nagel version of reduction, right? You have a theory in the special sciences and the secondary science, you have theory in a more basic science of physics, and then you need some bridge laws that take the predicates in the secondary science that don't appear in physics and make some sort of claim that connects them, right? So, and they're often called bridge laws, right? These connecting laws. And so it's worth taking a moment to wonder what is the nature of these bridge laws, right? Um, so first of all of these, so what are these arrows, right? We have a, again, for Nagel, it's a deduction, right? So we're using sort of the language of logic, these conditionals and biconditionals, but what do those really mean, right? Outside of logic, what meaning do we attach to them? And Fodor doesn't know, right? It's not, he didn't come up with the theory, so he's sort of asking Nagel, but there's a couple things we can say for sure that they're going to need to be transitive, right? So if A arrow B and B arrow C, then we should be able to conclude A arrow C, right? And that's the case because we want it for the reduction, you want it to be the case that if psychology reduces to biology, biology reduces to chemistry, and chemistry reduces to physics, then you should be able to say that, well, that's transitive and psychology reduces to physics. So that's one thing about these arrows that must be the case for the reductionist. But beyond that, there's some other puzzles that it's not clear how let's say. So you might think in like line 1 and line 3, right, the law in the special sciences, S1, then S2, and the law in the physical sciences, if P1 then P2, you might think that's a causal arrow, right? That's a causal connection. Um, but if that's the case, uh, then those arrows can't mean the same thing as the double arrows in the bridge laws, right? Because that's causation is a one-way sort of thing, right? And those arrows point both ways, right? Biconditionals, metric, you could say. Whatever the arrows mean in 1 and 3, they must, I guess, mean something different in the bridge laws, right? At least in 1 and 3, they mean causation. And Fodor is going to say probably what you actually need in those bridge laws is an identity relation, right? Um, because if you thought that it was just a sort of a correlation, right? Every time you have an S1 situation, right, in the special science, you have a P1 situation in physics, and they just seem to always correlate. Well, that's not going to be enough for physicalists at least, right? Because that's consistent with their just with psychology being the description of the behavior of immaterial souls, right, that just happen to correlate with certain neural states. Um, and Fodor is sort of assuming that that's not the sort of theoretic situation you want, right? You don't want uh, souls to reduce to physics, right? You want everything to be physical. So it's got to be more than just correlation. So it's got to be something like identity, right? The psychological states just are physical states. Um, seems to capture what they're aiming for. Um, but he notes we have two types of identity, right? There's type and token identity. So type identity says sort of something like every time you've got an apple, you've got a fruit, right? And that holds for any given apple. Or you might say, okay, anytime I have a desire for water, I'm going to have a certain type of neural state, right? Um, and those types are always going to match up. Now that's a different claim than token identity, um, which, for example, the example of benches, right? So I can say this particular bench is wood, right? There's an identity there, a functional type, I guess, right? And bench, and then a physical type, wood. It's not a type identity, right? So it's not the case that every time I have a bench, I'm going to have the same physical thing. I could have a bench that's stone, right, or a bench that's made of plastic. So you might think that that double arrow in the bridge law, maybe that's just token identity, right? And for any given case of a special science state of affairs, you'll have some physical state of affairs, but it might be different every time, right? So some desires for drinks of waters will be a particular type of neural state, and then maybe another desire for water may be another type of neural state, or maybe not a neural state at all, right? Might be a state, um, right, in a alien creature that doesn't operate on neurons, right? It's based on some other kind of form of life. Or you might have for example, a robot that's programmed to drink water, right? And so the behavioral state of drinking water might in circuitry or whatever. So that would be token physicalism, right? If you thought, well, um, these bridge laws, type identities as a bit strong, a bit hard to come by, right? If given the variety there is in nature, so maybe all the bridge laws are token states. For any given special science state, some physical state. So maybe could that work, right? Token physicalism, is that enough to make this view of reduction sure? Uh, well, Fodor is going to say that's really the best you could ever do, right? Is token physicalism. He's going to give us some examples to say there's no way you're going to get type identity between the special sciences and the physical sciences. Um, but then he says token identity is not going to be good enough for reduction. Um, so you're going to have to conclude the reduction is false. And he's going to focus only on natural kind terms. You should remember this from the David Lewis account of laws of nature, where he talks about natural properties, right? And these are so things like being 3 miles from the Eiffel Tower, not a natural property. It's a property, right? It's a kind of description you can make of an object, but natural kinds are supposed to be just sort of the basic components that are important. We'd want to like that you could describe the whole universe just using the most basic things. So like hydrogen, natural kind. So here's the problem with reductivism. According to reductivism, every natural kind is going to be either identical to or coextensive with a physical natural kind, right? And Fodor thinks that this is unlikely, right? And maybe it could be true. It's not impossible that it could be true. That's an empirical question, but he thinks it's very unlikely. And here is sort of the general reasons why, and then we'll get into a specific example why you're not going to have type identity, right, between special sciences and physics. So first of all, you can often make interesting generalizations. He says, for example, counterfactual supporting generalizations, predictions, things like that, about events whose physical descriptions have nothing in common, right? And we'll see an example of this. And then it's often the case that whether the physical descriptions have anything in common is actually totally irrelevant for the special science, right? It doesn't matter what the physical events are for the special science to do its job and do it well. Um, And yeah, this is what special sciences do, right? They describe phenomena at a certain level that's much higher, sort of complex than physics, and they make predictions, right? They do explanation, and they do all this without worrying about whether again, the S1 and the S2 have anything in common on the physical level. So here's an example: Gresham's law. So Gresham's law is he doesn't really get into describing it. It says bad money drives out good, right? So basically, the idea is that you have different kinds of currency. You can have copper nickels, right? You could have aluminum dimes. You can have paper money, or you can have gold, right? Um, and typically, what happens? Say you have a piece of gold that's worth, $100, and you have a $100 bill. You have both those in circulation. the gold pieces are going to tend to go out of circulation. People are going to tend to use the more bad money, right? The one that's not intrinsically valuable. That's just a sort of an observed regularity in economic behavior. Okay, so that's what Gresham's law says. It says something about what will happen in monetary exchanges under certain conditions, right? It makes predictions. Those tend to be true. Um, so certainly any event which consists of a monetary exchange, um, so anything that falls under Gresham's law, will have some true description in the vocabulary of physics, in virtue of which it will fall under the law of physics, right? So I exchange, right, a dollar bill. I give you a dollar bill, and you give me a pack of gum. I can describe that in the terms of the fundamental particles, right, paper, and that make up right, the gum that you give me, and the physical interaction. I mean, there's some physical description that describes that. But a description that which covers all those sorts of events is going to be just wildly disjunctive, right? So, for example, like you can have monetary exchanges in dollar bills, strings of wampum, right? Signing a check, coins, right? All wildly different physical events, right? Um, so if I want to use Gresham's law, right, or to describe any given exchange, um, the law, which can be stated very simply at the level of special sciences, right, which is like, cheaper, right, or basically forms of money that are less tied, whose value is less tied to their that float free of their actual value, are going to drive out forms of money that aren't. So like dollar bills are going to drive out gold, right? I can state that relatively simply, um, but if I wanted to state that in terms of physics, I would have to say something like dollar bills or wampum or checks or aluminum dimes will drive out things like gold or silver or whatever. So what you end up, if you want to translate that into physics, what you have is like a big long disjunction, an or statement of all the different kinds of monetary exchange you could have on the left side, and then all the different kinds of monetary exchange you could have on the right side. And that's a problem for Fodor, right? So he asks, what are the chances that a disjunction of physical predicates, which covers all these events, right, all the kinds of monetary exchange that can exist, is that going to express a physical natural kind? No, no way, right? I mean, uh, again, this is just one example. He doesn't cover every example in every special science, right? But he thinks it's just very unlikely that in all these special sciences, right, and his most extreme example is this economic one, that all the things they describe are going to have uh, a, a, their physical descriptions are going to amount to a natural kind. It's obviously false in the case of monetary exchange, right? So wampum or right, whatever the cloth kind of paper thing that bills are made out of, or aluminum, right? This distinction is not a natural kind in nature, right? Probably several different natural kinds together. Um, and in particular, right, like a good law of physics that only dealt with natural kinds, there's not going to be one that covers those functions, right? Um, so um, if you want to say, right, as we want to say, like Lewis did, that right, our best theories are going to just deal with natural kinds, then it looks like there's going to be no way to reduce the special sciences to physics, right? You'd have to introduce these horrible, ugly that aren't natural kinds. Um, but nonetheless, the special sciences do say interesting things, right? So the point is that monetary exchanges do have interesting things in common, right? And Gresham's law, if true, says one of these interesting things that you can observe, right? But what's interesting about it has nothing to do with their physical description, what they have in common physically, right? Um, so he says, I mean, it's maybe possible that for all these special sciences, right, um, their natural kinds are going to turn out to be the coextensive with some physical natural kind, but it would be he says, an accident on a cosmic scale. It's incredibly unlikely that this is going to be the case. So it seems very unlikely that economics is reducible to physics, right? And you can use the same argument for almost any special science. So psychology, right? Um, Even if it's true that every psychological state is a brain state, and that's sort of, say, kind of token physicalism, um, this doesn't mean that there's going to be any correspondence between the psychological and physical natural kinds, right? So I might have a desire for water on various occasions, but it might actually be very different sorts of patterns of neural firing that instantiate that. Uh, my research indicates that that tends to be very much the case. Pain, right? You have things like phantom pain, right, where you can have a pain in a hand that has been amputated and isn't even there, and yet you have the same pain as before. Now, originally, um, pain would involve some neural firings in the actual hand, but then that same pain can be reinstantiated in a different, right, pattern that doesn't involve those neurons. So even at the level of psychology to right, to neuroscience, it seems very unlikely that you're going to have type identity in natural kinds. And it gets even worse if you consider the possibility that maybe robots or aliens could have pain or other psychological states, right? There's just no way that that's going to be the same natural kind, physical kind as what goes on in our brains. And if you look at science, like the way it's practiced, reduction just isn't the goal. That's not what we're shooting for. Right? We have all these different departments doing their own thing, right? They're not worrying about what's going on in physics very much. And the reason we have these departments is like we're not just wasting money on stuff that's useless and instead just funneling everything into physics. We need all these different departments to tell us interesting generalizations about the world, right? They don't need to reduce to physics in order to do their job. So if you want to save physics, right, you want to keep just natural kinds in there, right? You really don't want it infected with all these weird disjunctions that you would get if you tried to just do token physicalism between special sciences and physics, right? So let's just keep physics nice and clean with its own natural kinds. Let's keep special sciences to their natural kinds and not expect there to be some lawful connection between all these different kinds. Right? It's just not in the cards. Very unlikely. Seems like a waste of time. That's basically, I mean, Fodor says a lot more and it's more detailed, but that's sort of the bird's eye view of it. Um, and our next lecture, our last lecture of this course, will be Churchland, who is in our very own department, who is a various times a reductivist or even a limitativist about psychology, but he thinks um, he offers a different account of what reduction is. It's not a deductive relationship like Nagel says, it's something else, and he thinks that that can be used to perform some reductions in between psychology and neuroscience. So we'll look at that